listening to the HR Mixtape, your podcast with the perfect mix of practical advice, thought-provoking interviews, and stories that just hit different so that work doesn't have to feel, well, like work. Now, your host, Shari Simpson.
Joining me today is Marty Dubin, a clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, and author of Blindspotting. Marty's work blends science, storytelling, and self-awareness to help leaders confront their cognitive blind spots and lead with greater clarity, empathy, and impact.
Marty, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast with me today.
I am looking forward to it. Thank you.
So I'd like to start by hearing a little bit more from you about what inspired the concept of Blindspotting, which is your book, and how do you see it showing up in leadership today?
Yeah. So I had an unusual career, and I was kind of cut back, semi-retired, if you will, right as January, right before COVID. So not a great timing. And but as I was sitting on the couch. We weren't going outside yet, and I just started thinking about my career and writing about it. Not really writing a book, just kind of making sense of that. And there were just things that started to stand out to me about how did I help people, both patients as well as executives, what caused people to change. And I realized that, I could go on about what I did, but it really was just one word or one hyphenated word, self-awareness. And so that's really what led to the idea, blind spots being what causes you to not be self-aware.
So your background in psychology, how did you make that move between, clinical psychology and entrepreneurship and, bringing those concepts to the business world and leadership? And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because I know for those of us who sit in HR, that idea of psychology and helping people in that way is, I feel like we're all earning a very mild honorary intro degree in that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, the human part is part of the H, right? So it's there. I got a doctorate in clinical psychology. The answer to your question is about identity, which is one of the blind spot areas I talk about. So my identity was as a clinical psychologist. I kind of thought that's what I would do, open my door every 45, 50 minutes, usher one person out and another person in. And I did that for a while, but they don't tell you in graduate school what it's actually like to do the work. And I loved the interaction with people. I just didn't like sitting in an office all day long and just seeing one person at a time. So I kind of found myself finding ways to get out of the office and get interested in other things. And that led to being interested in kind of the business side of mental health. And so that led to me with a couple colleagues co-founding a managed mental health company. We managed the mental health business for large insurance companies. And then we ran that for about 15 years and then sold it. And I didn't want to open a practice again. And I just found that this whole area of psychology and business could go together in leadership. And if I really looked at my career, I was kind of an entrepreneur as a kid in high school and college. And that wasn't part of my identity at first. And then I realized that really is who I am.
I love that. I love hearing people's kind of origin stories and what got them to be where they're at. When I was thinking of talking to you around the concept of blind spotting, inherently it's uncovering things we don't see. How do we even begin to do that? By definition, we don't know about them.
Yep, it's a catch-22. So one of the first blind spot areas that I became aware of is when our strengths tip over and become a problem for us. And we don't recognize that because they're our strengths. They kind of are what help us 90% of the time. But there is that 10% say where it would be better for us to react in a different way. So here's one quick way for your listeners to kind of get a handle on that. Think about your strengths. What are those adjectives that you would describe yourself? Hardworking, maybe for HR, empathic, achievement-oriented, whatever it might be. Think of a few of those and then put the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too organized? What happens when you're too decisive? What happens when you're too empathic? And it's probably what your friends or spouses or partners tell you at times. Those are probably a point of that could be a blind spot. It's like you're using that default strength of yours when in fact, maybe almost the opposite would be the right choice in some situations, and you're just not recognizing it.
It's such a good example. This happened to me a couple years ago. I had a good friend, like you mentioned, who can kind of call these things out. I have high curiosity and I love building relationships. So often that looks like when I meet new people, I ask a lot of questions. I want to know where they're from, how their life is, that kind of stuff. My one friend kind of called me out in real time in such a good way. She was like, "Oh my gosh, give the person a break. Like you're asking too much. You're too curious, right?" Like it's coming across as intimidating. So I think that's such a great place to start. What resistance have you seen when you've worked with people as they've started to uncover these truths, when they look at their strengths and go, "Yeah, but it's such an asset for me."
Right. Yeah, there are some people that recognize the concept of it tips over, but there are other people that just, as you said, that don't. And so I built a model that's in the book of these 6 blind spot areas, and the model is built around the fact of what can you change and what can't you change? And you can always change your behavior. Just like your example with yourself, you could say to yourself, "Oh, this is a situation where I shouldn't be so inquisitive," and just stop asking questions. So I think the area, if somebody is like can't kind of get their head around their strength could be a problem, it's really try to focus on the behavior. What behavior is getting in your way? Are there situations or types of people where you find where that strength isn't working and you're just kind of puzzled? And maybe you're thinking it's their fault or the situation's different, which, those are all true. But at the end of the day, what we have control over is ourselves. And if you want to make a situation, have a different outcome, you have to show up differently.
As you've worked with other leaders, I'm thinking specifically about our HR professionals. What do you think their most common blind spot is?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer, I guess, is the first is the direct answer. And, because I haven't done this in a kind of scientific way, if you will, it's just who I'm working with at the time. And I think we all have blind spots in all these 6 areas that I talk about in the book, and they're just part of who we are. It's not a judgment. It's just kind of a default in the system. It's just like computer operating system doesn't work perfectly all the time for every situation. So it's just recognizing our own unique personality. And that's I have difficulty with a lot of the things that HR tools that often are given to HR professionals, because whether it's whatever kind of test, because they end up trying to box people into certain, here's the 5 types of this or the 12 types of that or whatever it is. And those are true at a kind of a general level, but when you get down to the individual, we're all so much more complex. So you really need to kind of look at each individual.
It's such a good point. When I think back to some of the training that I've delivered to other leaders, things like a DISC assessment, those types of models, you go through kind of here's where everybody scored. And some people just stop there, right? Here's where everybody scored. Here's kind of the buckets, like you said, the box you live in. We're so much more dynamic than that. And our experiences really can broaden what that looks like.
I had a leader or CEO recently, an entrepreneur, who was described by their team as humble, warm, engaging, and arrogant. I mean, how can you be humble and arrogant? But you can. And so, right, I mean, those are like as far away boxes, as far away from each other as possible. And it's because in certain situations and in certain dynamics, the person showed up arrogantly. And so they thought of themselves as humble, and I think probably at a core, that was more common for who they were, but they definitely came across arrogant when they thought they had the answer, when it was they were the one making the decision, when all that power and responsibility was on their shoulders. And so helping them realize, rather than use a label, "You're arrogant," it's just, what is this kind of behavior? Dismissive behavior was what they were showing up with, and that's what needed to change.
Well, it's really good you mentioned it's not necessarily core of who you are. It's a behavior that you're demonstrating. I think that comes though with having leaders who are willing to kind of go down that emotional intelligence road and really examine themselves. How have you helped people kind of get to that first spot so that they can be more emotionally aware so that they can start to do this blind spotting work?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm in kind of a fortunate position that when they come to me, they're either highly curious and want to get better, and it's just like, help me get better. But I definitely have people that have, quote, been sent to me, if you will. And self-disclosure breeds self-disclosure. Vulnerability breeds vulnerability. So, and I do this in the book. I share some of my blind spots and the stories in the book, and I do that with profession, with the kind of person you're talking about. And I'm sure many of your HR leaders do that. And that it if you can be very genuine and very vulnerable, and if almost get into the point where you switch roles and have them talk about your blind spot or your weakness, your difficulty, then you're at least creating an environment that is more likely for them to be able to feel comfortable opening up.
Well, and that creation of environments is so important. In often HR, we get tasked with owning culture, which I don't know that that sits just with HR. I think that's a much broader, scope of responsibility. But it leans into the concept around, the stories we tell ourselves. We do it in our personal lives, we do it in our work lives, especially when we don't have all that information from leadership. As HR, how do we help change that narrative and create better stories in the workplace specifically that can create these cultures where employees feel safe to acknowledge, hey, I make mistakes, hey, these are my blind spots, hey, this is what I'm working on.
You just opened up a really big package in my mind. There's just a lot of layers to what you just said, and stories are so powerful. And stories do carry culture. When I go to one of the fun parts of my job is I go into all these different industries that I know nothing about. And, as a consumer, you kind of think all of, this kind of company, they're all the same. Well, they aren't, right? And so to find out culture, I usually ask, tell me some stories about the company or the leaders, or, what stories do you tell a new employee? And you right away start to find out culture. And so to your point, that should be a very deliberate, conscious, strategic role for, quite frankly, I think the CEO owns culture. HR participates in culture, communication participates in culture, but the CEO and the senior team own culture. How they show up every day. They should be asking themselves every Friday, what did I do that's consistent with culture in terms of my behavior and the stories that people are telling? And then HR can be super helpful in retelling those stories to new employees and so on. So that's one level of kind of what you talked about. And I think it's, taking all those values that or on the wall of what the company is about and turning them into behavior stories. And if one of the stories is we're a company that gives honest feedback with each other, and then people in the company say, not so much. It's like, what does that really look like to give honest feedback and to have a culture of feedback and a psychological safety to give feedback? And it really has to build over a long period of time with stories that reinforce that kind of message.
Psychological safety is something that I've talked a lot about on the podcast. I talk a lot about it when I speak. And I think it is one of those things where there just isn't enough training, for lack of a better word, for leaders on
Yeah.
how to do it. What is your advice to those listening to cultivating psychological safety? What are some of the table stakes or building blocks that are needed there?
Yeah. So certainly emotional awareness and EQ is a big piece of it. But I think all the high EQ is good as a human being. At work, it's good because you wanna get a result. Work is about performance. And so I think being really expert in your emotions is about being able to communicate them effectively to get some kind of result. So I think first thinking that, getting really skilled, more skilled in EQ, but it's skilled, as I just said, for a performance effect to be strategic. And so that means it's about communication, and it's about thinking how you're communicating all the time. And maybe just one little tip that's really effective is the concept of meta communication. Meta means about. And rather than only communicate a statement, you can talk about why you're communicating that statement. What's the frame around the picture? Or just by saying, we're going to have a difficult conversation right now. It's going to be difficult for me and for you. That's a meta communication that sets the stage, that already communicates a lot of emotional information just in that one statement. And then you can get into it. So if you feel like you're getting stuck, and things aren't going well, take that step back and say, all right, let me do a meta communication, which often means Why are we communicating? What's the context going on right now? And that usually, can create great alignment with the people in the room.
I hadn't heard that term meta communication specifically, but it's a tactic I've used as a parent, So I am a mom of 3 boys, and my husband is a firefighter who works a 24 on, 48 off the shift. So, often a lot of parenting things just had to happen when I was home. And so I would often use the phrase with them, we're going to have a 5-minute awkward conversation. It's going to be awkward for me. It's going to be awkward for you, but then it'll be over and it'll be fine. And every one of those conversations went well because I used that tactic.
Yeah, that's psychological safety right there, isn't it? You put a boundary around it all, and you gave the rules, and that created a tremendous amount of safety.
Yeah. How do we help leaders though get to that vulnerability without maybe the story they're telling themselves being that I'm going to be perceived as weak if I'm vulnerable?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, if they maybe ask them, who are the most effective leaders you think about, and that you've encountered, and rarely are those are almost always leaders that are very expert at emotional interactions and are using emotion about themselves and others in just a very sophisticated way. So, I mean, I think, leaders have to kind of grapple with the fact that, I mean, emotions are difficult. Some people are more facile with them and some people they struggle with them. And in the book, I talk kind of about emotions in a framework of hierarchies and how you can get more expert at it. But I guess, with the idea right in the beginning that I'm going to be a better leader, the more facile I am with being able to use emotion, is the first step.
Well, and I'll tell you, as somebody who has worked with a lot of leaders, the ones that are vulnerable, they don't come across as weak to me.
No, exactly.
Yeah. As we wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you this a little bit differently than I think I've asked before, but what's one question that leaders should be asking themselves before they make big decisions to make sure that they are being cognizant of maybe their blind spots as they go in to make a decision for their organization?
Well, I think it starts with, I mean, I think my book is directed about, you know, figure out where your blind spots are and what you want to do about them. And this is not about transformation. I don't know how many times you've heard transformation in leadership. It's an overused term. I've never transformed anybody, nor would I, nor could I, nor should I, nor would you want to be transformed. I mean, it's just a silly term. And the problem with it is it sets this expectation that it's a massive change.
Yeah.
And really, this is about small tweaks, small changes in our behavior. So it's really the question you're asking is, how do I need to show up? What's my behavior need to be a little different so that I'll be more effective? And often that can be a change plan where you've already identified, in this situation, with this, maybe in that example you gave with a big decision in my peer group, where we're going to make a decision. I know I'm going to be a better leader if I can show up as X rather than Y, which is my normal way of doing it. And so you prompt yourself, you're ready for that you have an acronym that tells you what your new behavior is, all those kinds of things to do to kind of show up differently.
Well, Marty, this was such a great conversation. For those that are interested in learning more about you and the book, I definitely will tell them to check out the show notes. There'll be a link to access your book and learn a little bit more about you. So thanks for sitting down with me, Marty.
Thanks. I really appreciated it.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find show notes and links at thehrmixtape.com. Come back often and please subscribe, rate, and review.